And so just to recap, you're a postdoctoral researcher at University of Pavia, and can you remind me what your background was before that, or anything else I should add? Like,
I'm a cognitive psychologist, actually. I'm a memory scientist, applying language models to the study of human cognition, both in terms of memory, false memory, spatial processing in the end. And yeah, I have a Bachelor and Master of Science in psychology, a PhD in psychology, neuroscience, and data science. And now I'm a postdoctoral researcher in Pavia, yes.
so, yeah, I mean, obviously, I know it's not the best time in Italy. It's like 6 o'clock, right?
Yeah, it's six
So,
in the afternoon, yes.
so yeah, I'm sorry for taking your evening time, but I hope this becomes just a fun, interesting
Yes,
conversation.
yes. I'm very curious actually. So also for you, it's not the best time in the morning. So yeah.
No, it's fine. It's a great way to start the day. And like I thought maybe a fun way to start is just to say that we're both scientists, we both do experiments, and there's an experimental quality to, you know, what we're trying to do right now. Because basically you're currently collaborating with my PI, Arna Ekstrom, on some papers. And here in Arizona, we run a bi-weekly journal club called Memory Club,
Mhm.
right? So it's like a bunch of labs in the university. We sort of get together and we'll just like choose topics related to memory. So I think it was like a month ago, I presented, because I knew you were a collaborator, and I presented one of your papers. Um, this is sort of the research line where you're looking at sort of linguistic distances, linguistic space, if you will, even though
Yes.
in a second you can tell me why that might be a
Yeah.
paradoxical term, right? Um, this one dealt with like a map of Europe, right? And then also like a smaller map of Italy during the behavioral section.
Yes.
And I thought it was so interesting, specifically like the sort of implications of that, that I went on and I read. I presented also the subsequent week on the body map paper, right?
Hmm.
Because I
Yeah.
was like, wow, it's a very different sense of space, right? Going from a continent that is so large scale that no one is really like you can go from Berlin to Paris, but you don't really have an intuitive sense of navigation because
Yeah.
usually you're going to go inside a train. To the body's like the opposite in some ways because it's also like something you don't navigate on, but it's sort of within you or
Yes,
like
it's a bi-directional object in the end, the body.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. And also I don't mean to talk too much. I just thought it'd be good to just set this up with some broad thing. I'm gonna shut up in a few seconds.
No, no, please. Again, let's keep this at the conversational level. I'm also
Right.
very curious about all the ideas about the intersection between episodic memory and language that you mentioned. So
Yeah.
I'm really curious to learn more about this.
Yeah, and so that sort of gets where I was hoping maybe just almost like to have a roadmap for the conversation, right? Like, and we'll keep it flexible. Like if you find a topic that's interesting, then we'll invest in that, and also be respectful to your time. So we can do like roughly 40 minutes to an hour. Is that reasonable?
Up to you. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and then once it's 7 o'clock in Italy, of course, and I'm sure you'll be hungry to get dinner or leave the lab or
Yeah.
whatnot. But yeah, with that connection between episodic memory and language, that's sort of with this like sort of roadmap in mind. Like I thought one interesting way that this talk could go is we could just briefly talk about this research line. The sort of DRM approach that you're using. Of course, I don't want to get too bogged in methodology. Like I mean, we have to go over it, and of course, you're an expert in that, so it makes sense for you to talk about it. But I think there's some really interesting implications here. And really, like when I was reading these papers, I was like, okay, these guys are doing an incredible first step in sort of showing that there's any correlation, right, between these sort of like amodal language spaces and the physical geography or like the actual geography. And the fact that you find any sort of correlation at all is like a miracle, right? Like that's
Mhm.
incredible. And then sort of extending from that, I was like, you know, like what is that language space like really, right? Like what is it really tapping into? And specifically, might there be cases where linguistic distance or whatever that represents more faithfully tracks or correlates with like cultural priority,
Mhm.
right? And just one sort of example that sort of came to my mind, I sent you this image um, in the email is like oftentimes the sort of maps that people might have might be sort of not true to Euclidean space because they might over represent certain areas that have a greater priority to them, right? So there's a sort of comical map that I grew up with in New York City, and it was like America according to a New Yorker. And
Mhm.
so it was basically New York is huge, Florida is huge, California is huge, and the rest of
And
the
the
country is
rest
really
is,
small, right? And I also shared with you an actual map from ancient Rome that was, of course, it's completely inaccurate because, you know,
Mhm.
Italy is the center of the world and everywhere else is small. But in some cases, that's actually going to how, like, what is the function of memory in the first place? Is it vertical retrieval or is it prediction? And, so.
Yeah, yeah, and concerning the Rome map, it is curious to note that, for example, the name of the regions in the empire were called according to the position compared with Rome as the North Pole, let's say, in which you have, for example, Germany superior or inferior, and the
Hmm.
superior is the close part to Rome, closest part to Rome, and the inferior is the the one on the other side. And so, yeah, there is some sort of interaction for sure that it's going on from a long time in this case, because in the end, language is more available than space at a given at some for some extent, especially in the large environment.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Like in that case, like I'm thinking that's like a case where language and space are sort of aligned on some sense because you can almost it's like you can have an egocentric view of yourself from Italy looking into Germany and like which one's
Mm.
closer to you, right? Um, but no, I mean those sorts of things are yeah very interesting, and that's why I was like this would be a fun conversation. But is that reasonable if we just talk about um, like what inspired this approach and what sort of questions or hypotheses did you have going into it and
Yeah,
uh,
sure.
yeah
Um, so I guess I just start.
yeah for sure
Uh, well, the idea of having some sort of a linguistic space, uh, as many scientific ideas, it's not really original or starting uh, from nothing. It's something somehow encoded in the literature, starting from Max Lower's early papers, and there is this masterpiece from Max Lower's showing that it is possible to retrieve Lord of the Rings map starting from Lord of the Rings novel itself. So the book itself encodes the map of the Lord of the Rings just from text only. And well, this is the first step in this case, and it's something that is completely mind-blowing from my point of view. And if we want to give a brief overview of how this is possible from a computational point of view, well, you have many ways, and nowadays we are more familiar with this concept of language model because, ChatGPT and all these AI models. Um, in general, we use like the old version of ChatGPT, which is not really a GPT model. It's called a distributional-semantic model. But what these models do is they are trained on large corpora of natural language, and in the end, they learn from words distribution in the language. They learn to, let's say, let's make it this simple. Uh, they can build um, it's very hard when you're into something from a long time to make these things simple. Um, uh,
Like,
we can say that let's make this very simple. They learn the meaning of a word from the context in which the word itself appears in the language. So they will end up learning that, for example, cat and dog are close in meaning just because they tend to appear in similar contexts. So you speak of a dog in a similar way as a cat, while you speak in a different way of a chair, for example, or table. And if we apply these computations to the space itself, uh, we see something that is very simple, I guess, and that we demonstrate from a computational point of view is that, for example, we speak of Paris as in a similar way as compared with Berlin than to Beijing, just because, Paris is in France, Berlin is in Germany. They have they tend to appear in a similar context for many reasons. They can have a similar weather, they have similar historic roots, and so on. And well, demonstrating that somehow language encodes uh, some part of this very large scale spatial information is not so huge, I guess. It's something. Um, while demonstrating that humans can rely on this kind of information while solving, let's say, a cognitive psychology task like like the ones that we employ, it's another, it's a completely other topic, and it's way
mhm,
more relevant in this case because it tells that well, when you, for example, what we did for the our special processing paper, but also with the body, and in general, this is a very common task. So you just give two alternatives and stimulus on the screen, and you just have to indicate which of the two alternatives is the true one
mhm,
according uh, to your thought, to your memory, or whatever, to your processing in the end. And for example, in the spatial task, we showed one Italian city on the screen and just asked people, um, for example, is it closer to the north or the south as compared with this other city, for example? Or, for example, we showed two cities and indicate which one of the two is northern. And in this case, of course, there are trials uh, more difficult than others, more complex than others, because if you say, for example, Milan and Venice, which are overall at the same latitude, it's harder than to say Milan and Naples, which are one
mhm.
north and one south. But in the end, the point is that, sorry, and the same can happen for the body. So if you say chest and shoulder, it's harder than if you say shoulder and foot, whatever. And well, it happens that the similarities extracted from these models can in the end predict behavior sometimes better than actual spatial information. And uh, again, among the papers that you cited, the body, the spatial, and so on, I think that the body is more important, even though the journal in which it was published in the end was not as good as the other one. But science, weird
Yeah.
stuff happens, because we show that in the body, the two sources of information, language and space, can can stay in the same model, and so that people use both information, both sources of information. And so we clearly show that there is no only language, no only space, but they can integrate each other. They are two sources of information that can collaborate in building meaning. And so, yeah, this is the point on the studying space through language.
Yeah.
Um,
And one thing that you clarify in both papers is that you talk about linguistic distances and linguistic space, and it is a kind of vector space, but you're
yes.
careful to clarify that it's not, people shouldn't think of it as a Euclidean, geometry, of course, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, this is a jingle jangle in the end because it's called a vector space, but it's not a space that we can really understand because we are used to this, this three-dimensional space or bidimensional, um, and in the
yeah,
end, the space that we are using, the vector space, is not B or three-dimensional, it's 300 dimensions, for example. And
yeah.
we
So,
cannot really understand what that means. Yeah.
I mean, so like navigation researchers, I think like Arna would, I don't want to speak for Arna, but they would likely say that, the critical thing here is that this kind of space is unlikely to be implemented by grid coding, right? Or like the sort of like biological systems that we know exist in entorhinal cortex for traversing 2D, 3D environments, right? Um, so I think sometimes just like having a naive, because I'm, relatively naive to your work, and when you were talking, just a few things came up, like for example, um, the way it was described, I think, in the introduction, at least one of the papers, is that the sort of model that you're using, it's maybe not quite an LLM, but it's a step more sophisticated than previous approaches on language, which from my read just employed a frequentist approach. I'm not talking about frequentist stats, but just looking at
Yeah,
partial
yeah.
frequencies, right? Just
Yeah. This is this is like the co-occurrence model, which is the one that lowers used, and yeah, in the end, as you can see with these AI models, they end up being better and better and better and more sophisticated, and as time goes on in the end that they started using, let's say, yeah, frequency of co-occurrence in the same sentence. Um, and in the end, the example that we always make is that the models that we are using that right now are quite old in the end, but we are not using them because they are good in performance and that's it. We use them because they are more plausible from a cognitive point of view. So we can draw a parallel between their functioning, their algorithms, and our mind's algorithms. While of course ChatGPT is huge and way better from many points of view, it's not plausible. So
yeah,
this is something that we have to keep in mind while looking at these models. And these models, for example, can understand that doctor and physician are synonyms, even though they never occur in the same sentence. Okay, almost never in the natural language. So they can understand this kind of subtle uh, synonyms, even though they are almost never in the same sentence again. And just by looking at the context in which they appear, because again, they appear in the same context. You speak of a doctor in the same way in which you speak of a physician, because in the end, they are almost the same thing. And um, yeah, we had this innovation, but again, one point I really want to make is that these models are old, but they are plausible, and we are using them because they are plausible, and we are not using more advanced models like GPT ones, for example, because they are not so realistic in terms of algorithmic implementation as a
yeah.
parallel with the human mind.
That makes a lot of sense. And of course, I'm not an AI researcher, but my understanding is that GPT has reached this level of like runaway complexity that even most AI researchers don't fully like no one fully understands what GPT is doing, which is fairly dystopian. But
Yeah,
so
but sorry. Again, another point is that GPT models are made by engineers that care about performance, and this is wonderful. This is juicy when you need uh, a model that works perfectly in a given task or many tasks like ChatGPT. But if we are looking at the human mind, then we are interested also in understanding the algorithm in the model that can draw a parallel with the functioning of our mind in this case. Sorry if I
right.
interrupted.
No, no, no. That's a great transition to where I wanted to lead, because that's precisely what you do in both papers. Is you see if this DRM space um, mimics the actual behavior of participants, of people, which includes also human biases and human errors, right?
Yes.
So, like one example, when I was trying to explain this to the not participants, to the sort of audience when I was presenting a paper, I was like, think about how London and Paris are really close to each other, right? But I think if I pulled the average, I mean, especially the average American who doesn't have a very solid geography of Europe, that person would probably think that London's closer to Manchester and Paris is closer to Lyon or something, right? Because they exist in like
Two
separate
different
cultural
countries.
context, right? Um, and so that might be like one example of like this, um, the geometry of this like linguistic DRM space better mimicking or mirroring like humans' biases in memory than an alternative model where we all have some sort of like strict map, which seems like um, way too rigid for biology, right? Which is always more multidimensional
Mm.
and whatnot. But so linking a few of these ideas together, one thing that you touched on a few minutes ago was, especially in the body map paper, how there was this possibility that participants were recruiting both systems, like maybe a more, map-based uh, geometry of the body, and also the sort of a more language-based repository of knowledge, right? In a sort of interactionist way, right? Like there's some situations where the sort of language information might be dominant, other situations where the sort of the more strict geometry might be dominant. And what I thought was interesting is that I think also in the Europe paper, there seemed to be a consistent result, which was that when you looked at accuracy, right, when you treated participants' accuracy as the main outcome variable, and you run these models where you have either spatial distance versus linguistic distance as a predictor, then usually spatial distance was a better predictor, right? And
Yes.
linguistic distance, it was like sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't predict well. But when you looked at reaction time, specifically for correct judgments, then linguistic distance was always robust, right? Maybe not more robust than spatial distance, but I mean, the fact that it was equally robust is already like, pretty incredible. So I was
Mhm.
like, this is an interesting, result, right? And so, I mean, there's all sorts of hypotheses that one can make as to why we see it. Maybe it's the kind of thing where when the evidence is weak, we consult a more like allocentric, um, sort of semantic like space, which is like, okay, like I don't know where Hungary or Budapest is relative to Rome, so I have to consult a map. But if I'm Italian and I'm always traveling between, let's say I'm a businessman who travels between Rome and Palermo like every weekend, then I don't have to consult a map because it's so familiar to me, right? And then the sort of language-based model of like my whole lifetime of people talking about these two cities is going to be activated, and I can just sort of respond in a really rapid way. So that was like my best guess as to why this result was being observed. But I'm sure that you and your group had also hypotheses as well. But
Well, Your idea is very interesting, and well, what I had in mind is like I guess that we can reach many explanations for this effect. From a general, let's say, very superficial point of view, I would say that the most simple explanation is that people in the end are retrieving a real map, so a correct map in the end, but they build it through language and through space, through the interaction between the two. And this is why, in the end, accuracy is better predicted by spatial information, real spatial information, and reaction times, which is the time that you need to build the correct judgment in the end, is better predicted by a language. Um, one point I would be very curious to investigate is something that you mentioned here is like what are the individual differences in this case? So, for example, is a person moving more and more through the country, or more, let's say, a person that doesn't move from its city, uh, better in the spatial or in the language. So, what is the exact mechanism from an individual differences point of view? Because it could clarify what we are looking on. At the present time, we know that there is some variability as any effect. We know that there is variability around this true effect, but why a person with a strong effect has this strong effect is something I'm really curious. Um, Something that we thought of is like using so for example, it could be the case that people more into language, so for example, people that read more book, for example, more exposed to language, could be better in the language side as compared with the spatial, for example. So this is an option that we were actually looking at. Um, at the same time, I have no real other clues about what could drive this effect besides, let's say, expertise itself in the
Mhm.
navigation, in the amount of information that you know of the places that you're navigating into, mentally navigating in this case, and uh, again, my idea is that these are two systems that are very interacting. And if you want to draw a parallel with another, say, famous dichotomy, which in the end it turns out is a false dichotomy, which is the difference between episodic and semantic memory. As you know, now they are somehow rewriting the fact that they are not two different
Yeah.
boxes, but they are overall on a continuum. And depending on task demand, you allocate more resources on one side or on the other, or you rely more on the one or on the other. And I think that in this case, we will reach a position in which we see these two languages space from a similar point of view. So depending on the task, depending on your expertise, depending on the complexity, depending on the resources and so on, you reach a point in which you rely more on one or more on the other or on both. So yeah, this is my idea at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And just coming from the navigation world, I'd love to send you some citations that I cited in my most recent paper. And this might ring a bell. You might already know what I'm talking about, but there's some literature that suggests that if you just look at human populations, you will find variation in people who employ allocentric navigation techniques versus episodic. So this is sort
Mhm.
of harkening back at that semantic episodic like gradient, right? We shouldn't call it like a categorization. But what you usually find is that some people will just like implicitly or like use allocentric techniques like comparing the relative position of landmarks. And if you ask them after a navigational task, they'll be able to like, be like, oh yeah, like I was walking north, even though they were never instructed explicitly to memorize this sort of map, right? And what you find is that other people employ what we call much more like episodic system, which in navigation usually just refers to pathfinding, right? So that's like egocentric. You're always like digesting the environment relative to the position of your eyes, right? So never just the body's always like involved in how you experience the environment. And what you usually find is that the latter group has much more rich, sort of episodic, vivid recall of every trial, right? Because they're always experiencing it from the first person's perspective, or they're more likely to sort of encode and consolidate this like first person experience of navigating the environment. And yeah, like you're saying, in the same way that episodic and semantic, it's likely more of a continuum. There's like cases where an allocentric approach is more robust, right? Because once you have that map, then you can sort of consult it for every trial. And it can be, you know, computationally expensive from the perspective of the brain to, you know, encode, consolidate this vivid navigational experience, because then that leads to, you know, misattribution errors and whatnot. But no, I think that's a really, you know, fascinating question. We basically, I did an experiment recently with my PI where we looked at a similar, it's not similar, but it's sort of analogous, where we had people wear VR glasses and navigate this virtual town, right? Just over like, you know, 36 trials. And then at the end of the test, they were instructed to sort of just do episodic free recall. So the sort of town, the VR goggles went black, and they were just asked like, hey, can you like talk about what just happened, right? And then we also ran these tests of spatial accuracy, like judgment of relative direction, and also temporal accuracy. Can you just like reproduce how long that trial was? And then so we were interested in seeing basically how well the episodic recall correlated with these sort of objective measures of spatiotemporal encoding. And we found that they were largely separate, right? And as in, there were some people who were like experts at having a sort of like map-like knowledge based on their ability to know, let's say, that the bank was north of the park, right? But their episodic recall was very sparse, right? And just the approach that we used was just to run a PCA, right? Because we found that there was like all sorts of really interesting differences where some participants were more likely to, you know, use episodic details to bolster knowledge, and others more likely to use objective space-time. But I don't know. Yeah, so I'm just saying that's a super interesting direction. And just in the spirit of sort of, unless you had something to say to that, I was going to talk more about the Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Rings thing in a second. I'll also keep track on time, so we're in 31, so we can talk for like another like 15 minutes or so, if that's okay with you.
Nice. Yes,
Um,
please.
yeah. So when you were talking about the Lord of the Rings, so that really like set up fireworks in my mind, and I didn't I didn't want to go immediately to this topic, but it's a topic of evolution, language, space-time, and memory, right? Like this constellation of incredibly fascinating topics. I didn't want to go immediately to evolution because it's also like evolution is like heroin for people who love theorizing without evidence, right? Because who knows what happened like 200,000 years ago, but we can have so much fun like creating theories and whatnot. And I'm guilty of that myself, right? Because I love thinking about like, you know, like prior, like your work is on these linguistic language-based spaces. And it's completely plausible to think that such a space would exist prior to the invention of writing, right? Even though you're training your data on text, right? Because text is just a repository of culture, but it's not as if people who have oral traditions, you know, lack that repository. It's just transmuted in a different way. It's just transmuted from like elder to child, often through much more like intentional, you know, cultural practices like maybe prayer or whatnot. Or I'm just thinking back to thinking about, like indigenous Aboriginal groups that exist today that don't
Mm.
do writing, that might provide um, something of an example um, of what human beings did to sort of transmute knowledge or transfer knowledge from one person to another, right? And you often see like maybe people aren't in a classroom, but they'll sit around in the context of like sharing a myth or like mythology and whatnot, which often contains lots of semantic information as well.
Mm.
Like, let's say, um, I know Arno right now is writing a book about cognitive maps, and he gets to go to Hawaii to, interview
Mm.
Pacific Islanders and a lot of the mythological folklore in that part of the world deals with just wayfinding, to
Mm.
get from one
Yeah,
island to
true.
the other, right? Because
Yeah,
that's
true.
just such a important priority. So when you're talking about the Lord of the Rings, what lit up in my head was like, what's crazy about Tolkien is that Tolkien himself was trying to, he wrote that book sort of early 20th century, I think soon after or soon before World War One, but he was really trying to mimic or recreate like a sort of Germanic or Celtic epic, right? I mean, that was sort of the goal. Like, I'm obviously not a Tolkien expert. You might know more than me, but
No, I'm
he,
not.
yeah, I think he had like maybe like Beowulf or one of these sort of like sagas, like in his mind as he was writing this. And and if you go like let's say to a source material, then we see sort of in these epics like potentially um, this pervasive like geography that often exists in all of them, and especially in the epics that were sort of transmuted from like shaman to shaman in communities that did not yet invent writing, right? So maybe a great example of this is like, like in the Indian context, uh, epics like the Mahabharata or the Ramayana were always sort of guarded by this sort of Brahmin class, and they were never actually even allowed to write it down because it
Mm.
was meant to be. I mean, there's all sort of interesting politics when you get there, but the idea is that it was just sort of memorized in your mind, and it would sort of by the act of recanting the Mahabharata, you're also recanting this geography
Mm.
of India, right? And I don't know, but I would think that it's probably similar with the Iliad and with the Odyssey, especially thinking about how the Odyssey is recounting the journey of this one man from Troy back to Greece, right?
Yeah.
And there's clearly a geography there as well, right? It's like this epic geography. And so I just talked a lot, so I want to sort of wrap it up and maybe see if you have any reactions to that. Of course, I'm not. These are all just like interesting ideas that I think about. And the real interesting takeaway is that maybe this is just a crazy idea, but maybe um, what human beings did, like pervasively, let's say, prior to the invention of writing, when this is maybe when language was being developed, when we had anatomically modern brains, but the precipice of like modern language was sort of in its formative stages. Maybe as a species, we were developing these sort of epic narratives as a way to sort of link language with space-time and memory, right? So what you often see is even today in indigenous communities that lack writing, you see people employing what you call like the memory palace technique, right? Which I'm
Mm.
sure you're obviously familiar with, but it's this idea that you sort of correspond or correlate points in physical geography with semantic knowledge. Usually when it's used today, it's like an imaginary palace or house, right? But if you, for example, if you go to Australia, you'll see that there's a specific Aboriginal tribe that uses this technique to sort of make a physical geography, let's say the rock formation Uluru, to turn it into let's call it a mythological landscape. So you'll have shamans sort of walk all around the rock, and each point, crack, and crevice in the rock is like a memory anchor for a different point in the tribe's mythology, right? And then each myth itself contains all sorts of semantic information, right? So you can see how for a community that doesn't have the benefit of writing to sort of store all this semantic information, um, that having, like a physical anchor linking space-time to language, to narrative, and ultimately to memory, right? Could be very economical and very expedient, right? So that's my theory in a nutshell. And I have another, like, as you can see it, maybe I'm a little bit too into it, or I just, like I said before, when we get into human evolution, we can make all sorts of crazy hypotheses, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, just wanted to share that briefly. Yeah.
Uh, eh, eh, well, it looks like a well-formed theory, and yeah, thank you for sharing it actually. Um, well, the topic of evolution is it's for from a certain point of view, it's also cruel because we cannot actually have a look to what happens in a non-written language, because of course you cannot train your model. You could in principle like record what people say for like 10 years and then you try to train your model. It's quite cruel because we can work only on hypothesis, and we can in this case, we are moving quite abroad from strict cognitive science, and we go to the root of why we use language. What's the actual relationship between language and space? And uh, well, my idea. Well, of course, space comes first because it's there before us. It's going to be there after us, as a humanity I'm speaking about. And well, uh, uh, from a certain point of view, it could be the case that we have, let's say, invented language to speak about space sometimes. It can be the case, and to, you have a friend in Paris, and maybe you've never been in Paris, but your friend can speak about Paris and tell you what happens there. And so you can actually use language to transfer space. It can be a medium to explore the space itself, to reach a more fine-grained processing that you cannot reach by spatial processing alone, because we have a limited set of resources, while semantic memory it's huge from many points of view. So having not only pure visual or pure spatial information at play, but having also linguistic information encoded via semantic memory, which is very, very powerful, can help people to explore space with a better accuracy. Uh, the point is that when you look back to what could have been like in 200,000 years ago, I guess that their geography knowledge was quite small, like miles around their villages. And I'm not an expert on this, so I can say a lot of non-correct information. But my idea is that language can encode space at different levels, depending on what are the borders of your environment. Nowadays, the borders are the Earth, all the Earth, basically. While, for example, from if we look back uh, again 200,000 years ago, maybe the borders were a few miles around the village, around the place in which people were. And so yeah,
Yes.
the sorry.
No, I would just like say briefly, I think you're definitely onto something significant. Not only has the borders of our traversable environment increased, but it's also become less experienced, right? Like I think 200,000 years ago, you would walk from place A to place B, but now I know I can fly to Tokyo, but I don't like I'm just getting into a plane and then I landed at a separate place. It's almost like teleportation a little bit, right? Like so I just wanted to say that briefly, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, maybe 200,000 years ago, it's a bit much. Maybe let's say about 10,000 years ago. But yeah, in any case, the idea is that language can be seen as an instrument to I not only well, it's not only a system to take notes, to remember stuff. It can be seen as a system to explore the world itself, to keep track of the world, and and also from a certain point of view to travel back in time because again you read I don't know, you go back to Dante Alighieri and you read the Divina Commedia and you have a picture of what it was, the time back then. Of course, it's some sort of fiction story, but you see how people spoke, how people spoke each other, and you have a way to travel not only in space but also in time. And it can be, I remember a very clever study from a few years ago. I don't remember the authors, but they showed that from looking at children, they showed that the the quality of the language used to retrieve a memory, to speak about a memory, reflected the age of that memory. So and not the quality of the language when it was retrieved. So it, it can draw a very good parallel with what we are talking about at the moment. So it can, the way in which we speak about the world can encode reliably some information, not only spatial, but also time. And in the end, I guess I will reach the notion in which all is one, all processing is one,
Yeah.
that can be seen from many points of view, and we should, from a certain point of view, refuse looking for the one processing over the others. It's just uh, it's just a core common concept that can be in many different areas, but it's not only space, it's not only language, it's not only time, because I know that time is another core organizer of concepts, and some people, some researchers see time as a prominent processing over the
Yeah.
others. I
Some machines don't think time exists.
yeah,
Like, or not quite not exist, but I'm thinking about Bujaki who, you know, says don't talk about time, think more about like motor action and space and all that.
yeah.
But I mean I just had some some final sorry, it seems like you're about to say something, so I didn't mean to cut
No,
you
no,
off.
it's okay, it's okay.
So so one like brief thought, just as another like tangential thing, but I think you might find it interesting. One of those thoughts that I'm not sure what the implication is, but like uh, your neighbors in Greece, right? From the Italian peninsula. There's this classicist whose name is Paul Verne. He's a French classicist. He wrote a book in the 1940s or 50s. Not sure about the date, but it was called "Did the Greeks Believe in Their Myths?" Right? And
Mhm.
the whole book is inspired by this apparent paradox that the Greeks believed, the ancient Greeks, right, believed that their gods were on Mount Olympus, right? Which is a physical place in Greece. And what this guy says is that, hold on, like it's not Mount Everest. It's not that tall of a mountain.
Yeah.
And he says you can easily climb Mount Olympus and see that there's no gods there. But for thousands of, I don't know about thousands of years, but for hundreds of years, you would go to Athens and people believed that there was a Zeus and a Hera on this mountain. And so the whole book it's very postmodern. It's hard to read, honestly. But I think his ultimate takeaway is that we, like as modern human beings in, this sort of scientific and rational age, have a concept of space-time that might be alien to how people thought thousands of years ago. And his basic takeaway is that likely what happened is that people believe that there are multiple space-times, right? And so, like, yeah, of course you can walk up to Mount Olympus and see that there's no gods there, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist, right? It's just that they exist in this mythological or sort of like noble space-time in which the Odyssey occurred, in which the Iliad occurred. And it's sort of an epic past, but it's also in the present at the same time. And it's like constantly reflecting or imbuing the present, but even though it's not quite physically here, right? And just sort of going full circle, we can see how this notion of an epic past, it might be something of a cognitive impulse that human beings have that the ancients were just honest about in their mythology. Yeah, it does get really philosophical when we start asking these questions of like what is language anyways, right? And I'm sure you could have one. I'm not sure if you had like an annoying reviewer to type character, but I'm sure someone could be like, oh, you're saying that language is amodal, but what if I believe in grounded cognition? Like everything is therefore modal, like language must be rooted in experience and whatnot.
Well, you said the right word, believe in grounded cognition, because I don't believe in grounded cognition,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
buying grounded cognition. I know someone is buying. No, sorry, this is a joke.
yeah.
Again, uh, let's make a step back and grounded cognition in general, applied grounded cognition, grounded only, very radical grounded, it's falling in the same uh, false belief of saying there is only one organizer, there is only one organizer, it's this one, no, it's this one. And by concentrating our effort only on one side, we are losing the entire picture, I guess. So sorry if I interrupted, but I
No.
get on fire with grounded cognition because
Yeah, no,
it's a classical example of a very beautiful idea with very nice evidence in favor that if it's applied too radically, too strictly,
mhm.
then it becomes just an ugly idea, I guess. It's
Yeah, it
not,
becomes sort of dogmatic, right? It
you're
becomes
not getting
doctrine.
value out of it, but you're
Yeah,
getting like, yeah.
no, I agree. It's like a closed loop because then it's like it's often what you see in academia as well, where you have a scientist who's young and they're coming up with a cool theory that's like going against the doctrine. But then when that theory becomes doctrine, and then you have like these older professors, and it becomes actually anti-scientific, right? Because it's like,
Mhm.
um, but if maybe this is like a closing, food for thought. Yeah, maybe grounded cognition as like a pervasive explanation for everything is extreme, but maybe we can think about like, aspects of language that might be more grounded or less grounded. For example, just evidence that like, when I think about the word hammer, you'll see more activation in motor cortex. That seems like reasonable. That's not trying to explain everything. That's like, okay,
Yeah,
like
true.
that makes sense. And so just going back to, I think one of the interesting results from one of your papers that we've yet to discuss is the body paper found different sort of um, linguistic distances that tracked, I think, with people's performance on the forced choice task. When the reference point for distance was the eyes versus the feet, right? Because if we're using a strictly Euclidean space, there should not be a difference if I ask
Mhm.
you where the hips are from the eyes relative to the feet. But of course, measuring things from the eyes tracks much more with the sort of like ecological experience that we have of human beings, right? Because the eyes are sort of the emanator of experience right there. So I thought that'd be like an interesting place to sort of maybe end the talk on, right? Like,
yeah. That's an effect that actually we were not expecting. In the end, we added eyes and feet as reference points just to add more information, to
mhm.
have another, just to randomly explore it. And then afterwards, looking at the results, we spotted this nice result. And I guess this is a link with the individual differences that we mentioned earlier. Um, not in a strict sense of individual differences, but meaning that you're used to explore your body through your eyes. So maybe for you it's easier to rely on spatial information or some sort of specific spatial information, while moving from the feet brings you from egocentric to a more fit-centric point of view in this case. And it gets you also an idea of how there is not only a specific spatial coding, because depending on the reference, your exploration is different, your navigation is different. So in the end, most of the stuff we are doing is very, very task dependent.
Mhm.
And this should help us placing things in context, placing result in context, and again, looking at the whole picture of what we are seeing. But I agree that this result is somehow consistent with a grounded cognition, embodied cognition point of view.
No, but that, yeah, I think that's a good place to end. And I think like that's the thing with theories is that there was a point where everyone was just like extreme into distributed cognitive networks or extreme to localism, and the truth is likely somewhere in between, right? And same thing with
Yeah.
grounded cognition. Like it's probably if you take it too extreme, then it becomes anti-scientific, but then
Yeah.
probably some truth to it. But I mean,
It,
this is probably a reasonable place to end. I realize that I don't.
I would like to end with a
Yeah.
story. Maybe you're already familiar with it. It's from Jorge Luis Borges. It's called From On Maps or On Cartography, in which he mentions that in a past empire, it's of course it's a fictional story. They had a cartography society that is very well developed and started building maps that were always bigger and more detailed. And in the end, they built up a map that was as big as the whole empire, and that in the end was useless. And so this is the key for our maps and for looking
Mhm.
at theories in the end.
Yeah, no,
So
that's
to,
actually a beautiful metaphor. Just thinking about how schema in general, like even the body schema, right? Like the whole point is not to represent the world as it is, but to represent the world so that you can usefully orient behavior, right?
yeah,
So even the point of memory isn't forgetting is a big part of memory, right?
yeah,
You
true.
that's really beautiful. I didn't know about that, so I'm
Yeah,
gonna
I can share it
yeah,
afterwards.